the steel from the past couldn't compare to just 1085. It's just.
I've made a lot of knives from spring steel. It's 5160.
Yeah, good stuff.
And I think that's probably one of the easier steels to work with because it's forgiving and it's really easy to treat. Let's talk about that for a second. Getting a handle on what's happening in a piece of steel whenever you're forging it into shape. And once you've gotten it to the point to where it's actually lending itself to a knife pattern, and now you're going to start doing your heavy grinds and you get preparing for the heat treat process. A lot of that stuff, one of my buddy, Bob Calvert, he's got a picture in his knife shop of a I think it's like a power line or something. And then he's got a crow, like a little doll of a crow, hanging up next to it. It's like a little voodoo thing, because they were making the joke that, the notion of hardening steel and turning a steel into a hard blade had this voodoo, and he said, oh yeah, you have to have a crow sitting on a power line within sight, and they made a joke of it. But there was this lore and legend growing up before I understood, or I had a basic understanding of what's happening whenever you are taking a piece of steel and going into the hardening process. And then, the notion of tempering and like you said, soft backing a piece of steel. Kind of talk through that process of just so people can hear it from a person who does it all the time. Maybe start from once you have forged it into shape. What's your steps? So you got a rough, scaly piece of steel. What are you going to do? Let's just say something like spring steel, like a piece of 5160, which anybody can get. You can go to the junkyard and get it for nothing virtually, and take a torch and cut a little piece off. And you can have yourself a forged blade relatively quickly with a small forge and a anvil and a hammer.
Right. Well, I mean, I have a lot of, I call them, they're unknown steels. I have a lot of them in my shop. I use them for personal projects and stuff like that. Nothing that I sell. What I do is buy known steel. If I'm gonna use 5160 in a knife, I'm gonna buy it. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of leaf springs today, you don't really know what's in them, if they're, have some kind of case hardening. I doubt it in a leaf spring, but you get what I'm saying.
A lot of the ones I have used for that, and I do, a lot of the ones I have used as a result of that knowledge have been older.
Yeah.
Leaf springs where it was pretty much, you could just about bet what it was going to be.
Right.
And I think that's a process that people go through in knife making. I certainly did it. Like the first things that I was forging out was, railroad spikes, which you can make a blade out of a railroad spike. It's not going to be the best, but it'll make a blade, and it'll get hard. It won't get crazy hard like 1095 or something like that will, but you can harden it, and you can make a blade from it. And I think as you're learning, you're making ugly knives anyway. Don't use a $85 piece of steel to do that. But once you get into the game a bit, then of course known steels is the universal go-to for people who are putting serious time. And then not only that, but as a maker, you have to produce. When you give somebody something, you've got to be able to reassure them and know for yourself. But say for example, you did have a piece of nice spring steel, and you were gonna harden it and get it blade ready. What would you do?
Thermocycle it and refine the grain structure. So when you're forging it, you're moving the carbides in that steel all over the place. They're not in proper alignment. They're all over the place. You got tightness here, looseness here.
From where you've been striking it.
Yeah, it's just all over the place. You want to reset that steel to where it was like when it was new, before you go into the hardening process. And you don't want any grain growth and all that stuff to be happening as well. So you'll thermocycle it, and there's procedures for each steel. Some of them are very similar. And then you're going to go to, you're going to heat it up and you're going to harden it. And I use a temperature controlled kiln for that. Mm-hmm. But you can use a forge if you got a way to monitor your temperatures and hold times and things like that.
So thermal cycling, as I understand it, would essentially, on the basic principles of it, would be to heat the metal and allow it to cool slowly.
Yeah, certain temperature, heat it up, let it cool to just cool down to where the metal's black. You know, you don't have to let it cool off completely, but
And you're heating it pretty warm, but you're not taking it to to a really hot temperature. You're not getting it to the point to where it's non-magnetic.
It depends on the steel, but most of them you're getting up around close to 1600 degrees.
Pretty darn hot.
Yeah, you get too hot and you're growing for too long and you're growing grain. You don't want to do that. You just want to reset the steel and get it ready to quench. So when you do harden the blade, which is the following process, that those carbides would distribute evenly in the steel, and you'll have an even hardness, even distribution, and a good tight carbide structure there.
I have experienced grain growth by overheating a piece of metal before, and when you you've messed up because I would take a test piece a lot of times if I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do, especially if I'm working with a metal that is not known or I'm unsure. A lot of times I'll take a little piece, hammer it out, work on it, heat it, put it in a vise, break it, and have a look at it. And if you have this beautiful little sandy, delicate pattern, that's a good thing. But that grain growth, you see it. I mean, it's very interesting, and learning how to read that stuff. It's like looking at wood and trying to identify what kind of wood it is. It's what's happening in grain growth. Are you burning alloys?
I'm not sure exactly what that is. That would be a
metallurgist question.
That'd definitely be a Larry Thomas, but he does a great job of explaining it. And I know it's something that you don't want because it's just going to weaken your blade. Mm-hmm. And, I do the same thing. I'll test break certain, especially if I'm developing or working on a certain procedure and I want to dial it in with my equipment, I would do brake tests, and I'll even take the steel and have them tested. Because I don't have a Rockwell C tester. I got files, hardness
mm-hmm.
files. And I can get within a point, but I'd like to know exactly. But if I'm working on a procedure, I'd like to know what it is. I can take it I got a friend's got a shop with a tester. But I'll break them open, and I want it to look like ceramic. Mm-hmm. And just on that break, just smooth ceramic. And then I know that I can, I've got my hardness procedure, and it's meeting the Rockwell C where I want it to be. And I'll temper the blade, and we've got us a knife.
So again, another term, tempering, which is different than heat cycling, because when you're heat cycling, you're really taking it down to its basic elements, its basic form, basic atomic structure of particles of the metal. Then once you've heated it and quenched it, then you would then temper it. And tempering is generally done at a fairly low temperature. Like you're working in the 1600 degree plus realm when you're working steel and going through processes. Then tempering is done in the hundreds of degrees, right?
Yeah, and it depends on the steel of what that range is and where you want it to fall out on a Rockwell C scale. So when you harden a blade, it's you drop it on the concrete or shop floor, it's probably going to shatter.
Yeah, they're wicked hard.
Yeah,
and I think that's a step that they missed a lot in Forged and Fire. These guys would get these blades just screaming hot, and they drop them in that big tank of oil, and a lot of guys didn't leave them in long enough. I would see that all the time. They'd stick it in there and wiggle it around a little bit, pull it out, make a big fireball, and then they would go and test and go, oh, it's not hard. Well, you didn't let the damn thing cool. You pulled it out before it was the temperature of the oil.
Yeah.
Something that fascinates me with the notion of what happens, and I think a lot of people are fascinated by this or don't understand it, is when you take a piece of hot steel and you bring it into a quench of some sort. These days primarily it's in oil, but you can quench in water with some steels, and a lot of the older techniques were quenched in water, but they weren't heated quite as hot. They would heat them very, very delicately and quench them in water. But essentially, as I understand it, the notion of using oil and different oils is that these oils have different temperatures that they boil at, or they start to react with the heat. And what you're using that oil for is to bring the steel to a temperature before it starts to burn the oil and pushes the oil away. And so some oils burn at 260 degrees, some oils burn at 300 degrees. And so you have to, that's the notion, that's why people use oil to do this. And when you put that piece of hot steel in there, it's blazing hot. The molecules are going all over the place. They're bouncing around internally. And then when you put it into that oil, it cools it slower than water would cool it. And then you have formation of, what is it, austenite?
Right.
And what's the other one?
Martensite.
Yeah.
Martensite.
Martensite. And that's almost a crystal
Yeah.
type structure that occurs in the steel. And that's when the hardness happens.
Right.
That's the magic of hardening steel.
Right. Yeah. So when you bring that blade up to non-magnetic, say we're working with 1085, you bring it up to non-magnetic, which is around 1500 degrees. So those carbides are in what we call solution, and everything's ready. You have even heat. You overheat it, you're gonna have other problems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a problem I've seen a lot when I've watched that show. They come out of there looking like the sun.
The tip's about to burn off.
Yeah, it should be more of a cherry-looking 1500 degree color.
Mm-hmm.
If you've done it enough, you know what that looks like with the eye. But I'm like I said, I use a kiln for that, and I try to dial it in. And when you come out of there, that carbides are in solution. I've held that probably for 10 minutes. Come out, quench it, and we go to hard. You know, the blade gets hard. I go as soon as it cools off, bring it and temper that blade. Depending on the steel, I may be using stainless, and I will air quench and go either to liquid nitrogen and do a sub-zero. As soon as it cools off, let it go to a sub-zero, or I forgot what the temperature is for liquid nitrogen. Come out of that and go
wicked cold.
Yeah, and you go straight to an oven and bring it back up, and you're just drawing your hardness down to a workable steel that you can sharpen and use it without it breaking. And if it's a sword, that temper may be lower. If it's a chopper, a little lower. Mm-hmm. But if it's a skinning knife or a folding knife, you may be working at a little higher temper or a little lower temper, but so you have a higher hardness on that edge. All of it has to do with what you want, that edge retention, what kind of damage you may expect from, say from a sword, which who uses swords? Mm-hmm. But choppers, big chopping knives like parangs and machetes and kukris.
Kukris, yeah.
And I make several kukris in different lengths and styles, and they're gonna be around. I'm gonna temper them a little bit, have the hardness just a little lower on the final than I would on, say, a skinning knife, and it has to do with the forces and the chopping and that sort of thing. You don't want to.
Do you soften the back of a lot of your knives?
No. I don't do that for any of them.
Unless you're doing like a competition chopper or something like that.
A test knife, mm-hmm. like the one. That's because I'm going to stick it in a vise and bend it 90 degrees.
Yeah, so it's got to have some flexibility.
Yeah, you want to soften it down to that edge and keep that edge rock hard as you tempered it, because the edge has to hold up through 2 cycles of cutting through a 2x4 twice, and then it has to cut a 1-inch free hanging rope in one swing.
Those cutting tests are brutal. I've seen them at the Blade Show before. Guys who were going for their cut test, and they have a tendency to use something, a style called a competition chopper.
Yeah.
It doesn't really have much of a point. It's more of just a blade, and it really and the handles are usually fairly simple.
Right.
But golly, they get out in the parking lot behind the Blade Show, and they'll chop 2x4s. They'll cut a big piece of hemp rope that big around. Cut water bottles. They'll be standing water bottles, and they just, right through them. And that's a whole skill all in its own. Not only do you have to make the darn thing, but now you have to go out and perform with it.
Yeah,
it's you got to practice that.
You're right. It has a lot to do, but like I said, it's going to depend. If your heat treatment's good, and it's not. Put it to you this way: when I made my test knife, it was a little bit too light. So it took me twice as long to chop through 2x4s. I had to chop through them twice. So it took me twice as long as if I'd had a bigger, heavier knife. but I was trying to keep my edge, my knife a little thinner so I could make those chops. But really, it was really hurting myself. I could have made that knife a little heavier. I made 2 of them actually. Did the test in my shop, and then I did it, at the actual test. And the same process. But it was like Master Smith J.W. Randall. He was picking on me at the actual test, and he said, it took him twice as long to chop through it. He got through it. And he was standing over, man, it's going to take you forever to get through this. Come on, what's the holdup? But when I handed him my knife, that after you chop the two 2x4s in half, first thing he has to do is shave his arm. And he shaved his arm, and he said, after all that abuse, took him twice as long, this knife still performs. He said that's good edge geometry and good heat treatment. So I was happy about that, but I could have made that knife a little heavier and got through that chopping a little faster.
So, something that I think a lot of people are fascinated with or don't have a good handle on, a lot of folks, is knife sharpening. That's a topic of great mystery for a lot of people. I mentioned Murray Carter earlier. Murray is known for his knives just being just crazy sharp, and he talks a lot about knife sharpening and the 3-fingered test of edge sharpness. And you really can read the blade with your fingers and rub your fingers down. A razor sharp blade, cautiously, you can feel everything on there. And he did a sharpening clinic in San Antonio a couple of years ago, and my father and I went, and we took it, and it changed my life. Now my approach to knife sharpening is much more precise with a lot more of intention. I think it's something that people want to know how to do, because here in Louisiana, everybody hunts and everybody fishes, and everybody struggles to keep a blade sharp, or they buy some stainless blade that just won't hold an edge for anything. You cut a little bit with it and you got to go back and resharpen. It just loses that ability to cut so quickly. If compared to a handmade fillet knife with a really precision steel with a like you said, right, edge geometry. How do you like to sharpen your blades once you've got something to the point where you're ready to sharpen? And I know we kind of jump from how do you heat treat all the way to how do you sharpen, but in between is of course grinding and finishing. You're going to go grind through a series of belts, then you're going to hand sand and really put that blade in a vise and really work it down. Once you've got the thing shaped how you like, what's generally your approach to sharpening?
Well, the majority of the knives that I make are going to be ground and finished, hand finished, down to at least 20 thousandths, and many times less, down to the edge before I sharpen it. That's a key to getting a good, long-lasting edge. If you've heat treated it right, that's where you want to be. One thing I don't like is to pick up a knife and look at it, and it has a nickel-wide secondary bevel on it. Mm-hmm. And what that means is you're going to go use it a few times, and you're going to, as you're using that knife, you're wearing that edge away. It's coming up, and it's getting thicker. So your secondary bevel has to get, wider and increased. It's just unnecessary, unless you're making an axe. Mm-hmm. You don't need,
or a butcher chopper.
Yeah, you don't need a secondary bevel that's that wide. So that's the first thing. I get it down to at least 20 thousandths or so, and I take it and take a belt grinder, and I form a burr on it with my belt grinder on a wheel, running at very slow speed with a 220 grit belt, and I form the burr. Then I move up to 2 more belts until I get to a 600 grit belt, and I knock that burr off.
Real quick, explain to everyone what a burr is.
So on the edge of the knife, look, if I'm looking dead at the edge, looking dead at me, as I'm sharpening it or putting that edge on there, it's going to start forming a burr over to one side. Every time if you drag down one side, I could pull a knife out and show you.
Sure. No, I mean, it's just once the grinding has started, essentially what you're doing is you're grinding until you reach the center of that edge, and then the metal that is being ground away now sort of comes to the front and is wanting to go to the other side. So that's
right.
your burr. And as you run your fingers down it, you can feel it. It's
yeah.
kind of rough.
Yeah, yeah. You can take your finger and just your nail and do that and feel it, or you can do this with it and feel one side feels sharper than the other. But that sharp side is actually the burr.
Yeah, and that burr is key, absolutely key to getting a blade sharp.
Right.
So once you form the burr to one side, now you're going to go and you're going to go from the other side, and you're essentially going to push those little jagged, ragged edges. You're going to push that back to the other side.
That's right.
And so, as you are starting to form this burr, you can just keep pushing it from one side to the other.
Right.
Then what do you do after you've got that burr down with your heavier grit?
So I can see that burr as I'm moving back and forth with that wheel, slow speed, and all of a sudden you'll see what looks like dust fly in the air, a little bit of dust, and that burr just evaporated. It peeled off, and you can watch this in slow motion. I've set up cameras and done that, and you'll see that burr pop off of there, and it may look like dust.
Mm-hmm.
Then I take it to a ceramic. I'm kind of old school, very traditional. I take it to a ceramic rod setup, and I polish out what I left with a 600 grit belt. Now I'm on a ceramic rod, and I'll hit it a few times, and then I'll strop it with leather until it is smoking razor sharp.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be able to look at that edge, and it doesn't look jagged. It looks smooth and polished. What I can see of that secondary bevel, I want it to be polished.
Do you put compounds on your leather?
No, well, I have used Green Rouge just to have something there, but I don't even use
The leather
anything.
itself is enough.
Yeah. Now, when you hit that leather, I'm not using a wheel. There's people use belts and wheels. They're awesome. I just use an old-fashioned barber's razor style strap, and I run that knife up and down that razor strap, and you can feel if there's any burr left. You're gonna feel it, and I'll work it until it's completely smooth.
And the notion of stropping, that's going with the sharp edge away, pulling back and forth, working it backwards. Now you're pushing everything to the primary cutting edge.
That's right.
Fascinating stuff, man. It's cool.
Yeah, it works great, and it's not refined, but it is a proven way of doing it. And I've done it that way ever since I started making.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was taught how to put the burr on it with a grinder. Now, if you run it too fast, you're going to burn your edge. You're going to remove the temper, and you don't want to do that. You got to run slow. You're doing everything barehanded. You can feel your edge, and if you're creating a bunch of sparks there, you're overheating that edge.
It'll start to change color.
Yeah.
I use a lot of water when I'm doing that. I dunk a lot when I'm doing that sort of thing.
Right.
It really, it's just, I know I'm not the only one who feels this way, because I've been to the Blade Show, and there's a whole slew of people that find this stuff very, quite remarkable. And there's not a lot of guys who are doing it. I am a novice knife maker. I have, metalworking skill because I've welded and I've built things, and then I got into jewelry and started, I work in metal every day, but, knives are not my forte. I just have a toe in the water, so to speak, for knife making. But I've talked with this stuff with a lot of people, and, when you don't know it, it's mysterious. It really is. Well,
a lot of it is created. There's a lot of mystery and folklore and things, and I'll cover this right quick. Like I said about our modern steels, we don't have to work out impurities. So when you buy let's use a piece of 1085. When you buy a bar of 1085, it's sent to you. It is forged already. It is a forged, cold rolled or hot rolled piece of steel. So you're getting it forged, and then you can forge it into a shape you want or what have you. So there's a little bit of this used to be in the past. I'm seeing some of it now, a little bit of snobbery out there between forging knives and stock removal knives. I do both. I always have. And if you take a piece of steel that comes from the factory that's already been forged, you cut a blade out of it, grind your pattern, make your knife, heat treat it. That knife is no better or no worse than a forged knife, and vice versa. That's just science. It's and if you take a forged knife from that same piece of bar, forge it out into a knife, and do improper heat treating, poor thermal cycling, you don't reset that grain structure, you got junk, a junk knife. The deal with that stock removed knife, if you're just grinding a bevel, you don't have to thermal cycle it. It's already been from the factory reset. It's set. It's annealed. It's ready to go. You can just cut your knife out, heat treat it. But like I said, I've done both, and I make stainless knives, stock removal knives, forged knives, Damascus knives, and there's nothing wrong with stock removal guys and or forged guys. And there used to be a huge back. Remember I was telling you what took me so long to become part of the ABS? That had a lot to do with it. A lot of bickering and who you knew and that sort of thing to get in those organizations, and they was fighting.
People decided what the right way was.
Yeah. And science has taken away a lot of these myths, like you need to quench magnetic north. It's just crazy stuff. Edge packing will help your knife performance. Well, if you do a proper heat treating and you did all this edge packing, when you thermal cycle it, you just reset your edge packing.
So edge packing is when you've got a knife shaped, and then you go back with a hammer and you're tapping it to compress the structure along the cutting edge in an effort to make it more compact. And I guess if you weren't going to thermal cycle it, it would have some effect, but essentially you have to go and temper the thing at some point in time, and it resets everything.
Yeah, and then that kind of comes from the ancient world. I mean, work hardening or edge packing or whatever you want to call it was necessary for bronze weapons, copper. And even to this day, if you're working with gold,
I know
you have to anneal it every now and then because it gets hard from work hardening.
We make wire and we make sheet, and we'll usually start with pure gold, and we'll add whatever alloy we're going to mix to it to change its appearance or properties. And then once we pour it into whatever mold we're going to use, if I'm going to roll out, a piece of sheet, I'll use something more rectangular. If I'm going to make, rod to make wire or to make square stock, I'll usually use an elongated form. Once we've poured it, we start rolling it or hammering it to get it shaped out. And then, after a few passes, you've got to take it and I use an oven a lot because, like you do, it's very consistent. I can turn the oven on to 1575 degrees, and I know, or 1250, I know it's going to, hit that temperature evenly. And when I started out, I did it with a torch, but I realized that putting it in an oven gets you this nice even finish. And then once you've done that, you can continue to work it. But if you don't, it'll crack, it'll shear, the whole thing goes to hell. So it must be done. I think in all metals when you're working them. But talking about the notion of forging as opposed to stock removal from a piece of sheet, we have something very similar in the jewelry industry, where cast jewelry versus hand fabricated jewelry from stock, and there is some validity to it from a jewelry standpoint. Primarily working in platinum. If you take platinum that has been formed into a shape by rolling or working it, you generally get a more compact, more resistant finished product, more wearable finished product than if you had something that's just cast. Because once you've cast a piece and you start shaping it, the idea of being able to compress the metal, you don't have that opportunity. Whereas with a stock fabricated piece, you can. And that's a very, very old-fashioned approach, and some jewelers still use it. It's a very, very time-consuming, difficult way to make jewelry, and you have to charge for that. And whenever you're hand fabricating a piece, it's many times more than a cast piece in most cases, because the amount of handwork that goes into it is just, it's hard to describe how much labor goes into something like that.
Well, I always tell people I forge knives. I love doing it. I mean, I love to forge, but mainly forging is out of necessity. There's shapes I can't get with over the shelf stock. I can't make Damascus with over. I have to forge that. So forging is just part of the journey or part of the process to get what I want. It's out of necessity. Now, I love forging. I'd rather just be forging anyway, but it is necessary to get things I want. If I'm making a kukri, for example, if I was making a kukri this long, I would have to have a piece of stock that's 4 inches wide or wider to cut it out. Whereas I can take a piece of 2-inch stock wide or even narrower, depending on thick, whatever. I can take a ball bearing and make that kukri. So it's out of necessity for me, and really is for Damascus, because you can't do any of that. I sell Damascus billets to stock removal guys. They take it and make a knife and make beautiful stuff, and it's your steel, but they're buying the steel and making the knife. Now I've heard there's some of this snobbery out there, and guys like, how is it, is it knife making if you buying a Damascus billet and making a knife, and it's your steel, but he's putting his name on it. And I'm like, well, did you make the steel that you made the Damascus with? You're buying the steel, and it's that kind of stuff like.
That exists in everything, whether it's fishing or archery. I do some traditional archery. And, of course, my traditional archery bow is anything but traditional. It's made out of aluminum and carbon fiber. But essentially, we're using very basic principles. But one could always argue that a person who made their bow from hickory is a better archer because he's made his bow from hickory. Well, yeah, but he's shooting carbon arrows. So unless you made the arrow from a river cane and a flint tip, well, then you're not a real traditional archer. But that is the same philosophy that I think you come up against a lot. And I think anybody who gets into those little minutia of the craft of it, you say you're not very competitive, but me, I'm a little competitive. I recognize it because when I'm making something, I'm always thinking, who's going to see this? And that is a competitive thing, whether it's passive competition,
right?
Because I'm constantly thinking, I'm envisioning in my mind, this jeweler that I know who's an excellent jeweler, or maybe somebody I'm in competition with for, business wise, what are they going to think when they see my work? And so I'm competitive like that when I'm working on a piece. But what it does? It helps keep me focused, helps keep me centered, helps to keep me in my processes and making sure that I'm doing my best with each step as I'm going through it. Because it's always in the back of my mind, what are people going to think of my work,
Well, you always tell people that the only person I'm competing with is me. Mm-hmm. I have to better myself. I have to do the best I can, and it's that is what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. At least from my point of view, is I'm competing with me, and your comment about the archery stuff. You can go to the first guy who started using a stone wheel to grind his knife with. You just imagine what the flint knappers thought. Mm-hmm. This guy's using a modern piece of equipment. He's breaking tradition with his stone wheel. He's got a huge advantage. That's not real knife making. And it's like that today. You got belt grinders, and everybody's like, I forged to shape all the way down to a sharpened edge.
Yeah. Or people who use jigs for their grinding.
Yeah. These guys, look at their work. That tells the story.
That's right. If it looks like they know what they're doing, then they probably did.
Yeah, and if it looks homemade or sounds homemade, it probably, it's going to look forged, brutally forged. Let me just say it like that, and brutally finished. Something that's sharp and pointy with a broom handle looking knife handle on it, and it may be some expensive knife handle material and just ruin it.
Yeah.
But that's. I don't know. That's kind of stuff I try to stay away from. Is snobbery. Everybody in this community, for the most part, are are good craftsmen
Sure.
and try to help each other. And that's who I try to surround myself with. And I try to share information with up and coming guys. And like I always tell people, I learn something every day, and I'm constantly learning. If not, you're just stagnant. You're going to be like stale water. Mm-hmm. Don't want to be there.
Well, I tell you what, man, that's real stuff. I mean, I come up against it myself, and that's this part of the dynamic that I love about doing this podcast or in my work, which is where I got the idea to do the podcast. Is I get to meet people, who have skill or who have a lot of experience in something. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's business or a trade. When you meet people who know a lot about stuff, there's a certain a contentment that they have, and maybe earlier in their career it's ambitious competition, but it usually once you get stable, that kind of gives way to the idea of let me share some of this information with people, because when you meet somebody who's really eager, who's asking good questions, let me tell you something, and you give them information that may have been hard earned for you. But golly, what's it going to hurt you? If you can share with somebody and inspire them or guide them in the right direction, I think that's a great thing that we do as people, and it's a very generous thing to do, and I think it's good for you. It's a form of philanthropy. You're giving away information that you worked hard for.
Exactly.
And it feels nice to help people. It really does.
Yeah, it's a great thing to build. You want to pass along. I mean, at least what you can. I mean, I learn something all the time. And just a while back, my buddy Steve Schwarzer was at my house, and we were discussing certain technique, and I always have my notebook when he's there, and just jotting down. And he's writing in my notebook, and those are keepsakes, I can tell you.
Oh, for sure.
But he told me something about a certain technique, how to fit this handle a certain way, and I'm like, I never thought of that. Mm-hmm. Same with other guys. J.W. Randall showed me something a while back, I never thought of. And he's like secondhand for him. Mm-hmm. It's priceless information. And, they're sharing it with us, and I want to do the same for people. And it could be little micro things that you're doing, little bitty tips and techniques.
I think once you get a good way into any craft, all the big stuff you learn that early on. It comes down to the little, splitting hairs, literally, details. That's what makes you great at what you do, And I tell you what, man, I thank you so much for coming and talking with us. This has been a terribly enjoyable visit. You and I talked a while back. I wanted to come to your shop and come and work with you a day, and I don't know what happened, if it was COVID or whatever. We got off track on that, but I definitely want to invite myself again to come by and check out your setup, because I'm very busy right now with my career. I'm busy with my children, but I still hope that one day I'll get to a place to where I'm able to spend a little time making knives, because I find such great pleasure in it, and I just wanted to really say thank you for coming and talking with us. It's an absolute pleasure.
Well, you're mighty welcome. I appreciate it, and you're welcome. Come anytime. I'm there every day. It's my day job.
Right on.
And, but I really appreciate the fact that you are a craftsman as well. And
thank you.
This conversation, jewelry fascinates me. Jewelry making. There's certain aspects of jewelry making that can work in my craft, like engraving.
What's funny is that it was right before COVID. Jason Knight and I spoke about doing a piece, because he was promoting this Be a Maker concept, and I talked to him about it because I saw him do a video on it, and I hit him up on Messenger and gave him, and I said, man, I'd like to really talk to you about this. And he's like, here, call me. He sent me his phone number, and I called him up and we chatted about it. And he was delightful and absolutely eager. And he said, man, I've always wanted to do a piece with with like a bedazzled, bolster or some sort of really neat guard on it or something like that, with, in a fine metal or maybe with some gemstones. He said, I don't know anything about gemstone setting. I said, well, I know everything about gemstone setting, and I'd love to do a piece with you. And I think we got COVID, and he got busy, and all that. But maybe we can try to do a piece someday and do a little mixture. You and I are closer together. It would actually could work out. Do you ever do competition pieces that you submit for judging?
Well, I did do a YouTube challenge a while back. It was called the Fantasy Challenge, and I made a fantasy knife. It was a mosaic blade. It looked like something the Grim Reaper would carry. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot of fun. Makers all over the world. It was, I think, 17 or I don't remember, 20 of us maybe.
You sent it to different people and had them work on
No,
different...
we made our own pieces and then had judges. And then we submitted the videos. But as far as collaborations, I've only done a few of those with local guys and a good friend of mine. And now I just did a collaboration piece yesterday, but It is not a knife. It is a fishing gig.
Nice.
That another channel come to my shop. We made it, and then he took it, and he's going to make video with it. And he's an outdoor survival, just extreme kind of stuff. He's a South Louisiana boy, but he's incredible. His channel is going to go nuts. It's called Adventure Fever.
Adventure Fever, that's a good name.
Yeah, it's awesome. But anyway, we did that. So I do stuff like that. It's problem is the time to collaborate on things like that.
I know hand engravers sometimes will put together projects where they take those stuff. Like there was a group of guys who did a 45, a 1911 45, and they sent it to different guys all over the country, and they would do steps and then send it on to the next fella. And it was fully engraved, gold wire inlay, and there was carving, and somebody did they did handles, they did scrimshaw in the handle, beautiful small detail finishing, and when you have that much talent piled into one thing, you can't help but be impressed with it, But man, listen. Thank you doesn't seem enough, but I look forward to seeing you again, and I look forward to coming to your shop. I'll get a big kick out of that, and maybe we can do a bedazzled knife someday. Put some diamonds and little precious metal on it.
That'd be fun. Would love something like that.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks. Thank you,
brother.
All the best.